English translation 437th contact. Saturday, 18th of November, 2006, 9:57 hours.
Hello there, you already come, my dear friend. Be greeted.
Yes, here I am. I had to first get out of bed and get busy in the bathroom, otherwise I would look like shock-headed Peter now. Actually, I should have slept another 2 hours, but it does not matter. Anyway, my joy for the greeting, my friend. Be welcome. Nice to see you again.
The joy is also on my part.
May I immediately make use of you with regard to two questions that, on the one hand, were put to me by Marianne, and on the other hand, also by Barbara and Bridget during a kitchen conversation.
But that is unquestionable.
Good, thank you. Then here's what I have written as an explanation for a question by Marianne, followed by my answer worked out in writing for the question by Bridget and Barbara.
Your lineage of primates becoming of human and ape.
Originally, the ape creatures and the human being descended from a single line, which formed as a physically wavering form, that is to say as a constitution, that is to say as a primary state, and was animated by an impulse energy spirit form, as the plants have. This impulse energy spirit form is, that is to say, was firstly given as an line of the primates arising from it, because in these physically wavering visin, an independently existing life form with its own individuality and personality in an impulse-based, instinct-based or consciousness form, that is to say in these initial Wesen, which was neither animal, other creature nor human, but rather just a kind of slimy, wavering plant-like mass, in which an instinct-based or consciousness-based evolving spirit form could still not incarnate, that is to say, bear into. It was only when this kind of Visin was far and highly enough developed to a primate, so that it possessed an actual brain, it became capable of receiving an combination of a conscious evolution consciousness and an instinct consciousness in the now developed brain. This combination of evolution consciousness and instinct consciousness was related to, evolvingly resulting from the form of the impulse consciousness, a hybrid spirit form, out of which two new spirit forms and thus two new lines and developments emerged, namely a hominid one, out of which, through the overall consciousness block, a conscious consciousness originated, and thus the conscious evolution-capable consciousness of the human being, nevertheless retaining to a certain extent the forms of the instinct consciousness and the impulse consciousness. With regard to the other spirit form, this formed itself as a pure instinct spirit form with an unconscious and therefore an instinct consciousness not capable of conscious evolution, precisely that of the apes, in which a part of the impulse consciousness was also retained. And when it is now taught, originally the apes and the human beings indeed descended from one line, out of which emerged the primates. In the origins of the development of the primates Visin, these were, in their form of consciousness, formed as such that their consciousness was directed both to a conscious evolution consciousness as well as a form of instinct consciousness and an impulse consciousness. Early on, however, a strong evolutionary separation took place, though which only one kind retained its three consciousness forms and made these evolutively into a single consciousness compound, from which the species human, that is to say, human being, originated. And finally, there is still to explain that on all the worlds in the universe which bear higher and high life, the evolutionary course to the human being, that is to say, the becoming human through the evolution occurs in the same wise. Consequently, everywhere primate Wesen, that is to say, initial Visin originate, from which, on the one hand, the human species develops in a further evolution, while the remaining initial Visin fell into a degeneration of the form of consciousness and thus remained primates, that is to say, become apes, as they are called by human beings of Earth. Then that is to be understood as follows. The spirit form of the human being after the developmental change from an Erline is in a state of the primate V-sin, and so in its initial body-related origin, a form which can develop itself, both positively as also negatively. If that is said as an allegory with regard to the unconscious instinct consciousness of the ape creatures, of the animals and the other creatures, in the sense of the negative as well as in the sense of the positive with regard to the conscious and consciously evolutive consciousness of the human being. Fundamentally, it is given with the first becoming of each spirit form that it comes forth out of an evolutive developmental change of an unconscious impulse consciousness, that is to say, from an impulse spirit form that is capable to developmentally change to the higher, and develops itself in the hybrid stage only to the actual conscious human or unconscious animalistic spirit form, just as that is the allegory for the material life forms which in the first stages during the conception, that is to say procreation and becoming, show a neutral form and develop themselves only through the further development to the positive, that is to say male as well as to the negative, that is to say female.
Kitchen Talk question, the 15th of November, 2006.
Question. What is actually an ishwish, or as the case may be, an ishrish, and how is this title distributed among different domains of knowledge? And how does the essence of wisdom have to be defined?
Answer: Ishwish, king of the essence of wisdom. Ishrish, queen of the essence of wisdom, knowledge and essence of wisdom. What is to be explained with regard to the Ishrishdom Respri? Ishwish, yours male, king of the essence of wisdom, and the Ishrishdom Riesp. JHRH born female, queen of the essence of wisdom, as well as with regard to the essence of wisdom, can subsequently be explained with Billy's formulated words. There is, for example, the level of the Ishwish and the Ishrish in relation to the technology science, the computer science, the history science, the chronicle science, the medicine science, etc., etc. The highest form of an Ishwish and the Ishrish is the level of the spiritual science, in which also the creation science and life science are anchored, just like, however, also all fields related to these. The spiritual science, and with it the Ishwishdom, is the level of the highest Ishwish spiritual knowledge, and the spiritual teaching, and therefore the most comprehensive knowledge and greatest essence of wisdom with regard to all creational laws and recommendations, as well as their following and the creational law-based life conduct, etc. at the level of the Ishwish, which is only surpassed by the level of the Shroud, for whom the very highest cognitions with regard to the spiritual teaching and the creational principles are characteristic. And it is precisely in this form, that is to say, at the level of Ishwish in relation to the spiritual teaching, that knowledge, love, and essence of wisdom are developed to such a high degree that no conscious errors of judgment and mistreatments against the creational laws and recommendations, nor any incorrect actions or other transgressions, can be committed any more, because the true love, as well as knowledge and essence of wisdom, have become too extensive and too mighty for them to be transgressed. The situation is completely different with the other forms of the Ishvish or Ishrish, who do not focus on the creational law concerns, rather on purely material areas, that is to say branches of study, etc., in which arguably one can also attain great knowledge and great essence of wisdom, whereby nevertheless these Ishwishs and Ishrishs of purely material fields of knowledge are not immune from consciously making mistakes, which, through serious transgressions, are directed against the societal or creational regulation, and by which even the most serious destruction and annihilation can be caused. This was, for example, also the case with that Elshwish, who in his megalomania created the Elshwish Mata, that is to say, the God's Eye, the Ring Nebula, in the constellation Lyra in our Dern universe, because he was an Elshwish of physics, science, and technology science, etc. And only in these material fields of knowledge did he possess a great knowledge and great essence of wisdom, and hence he was an Ishwish, that is to say, a king of essence of wisdom. In this context, it should once be told and explained that essence of wisdom, which is very often misunderstood by the human being of Earth, actually, in this material sense, means nothing else than great knowledge, rationality, and intellect-based cognition and an ability within material scientific domain, all of which results from a purposive material learning. With regard to essence of wisdom, the following needs to be explained. Fundamentally, two forms of the essence of wisdom are given, namely, firstly, the essence of wisdom of expert knowledge about a specific material area of expertise, or several of them. This essence of wisdom arises as highest intellect and rationality-based essence of knowledge, understanding and ability from the material expert knowledge attained, whereby no life-based, creational, law-based, or life experience-based factors, etc., are integrated into it. Essence of wisdom in this sense is based on a science in the sense of an exact material research and organized oneness of the knowledge, and it simply represents the totality of the science in question, its task and results, whereby it has nothing to do with true discernment, but is essentially only interested in the respective utility of the area of expertise, that is to say, area of knowledge in question, and is in no way sufficient, not even in the slightest iota, for the founding of a life attitude. Secondly, with regard to the spiritual consciousness-based, creational law-based essence of wisdom, the highest essence consists of the cognition, the knowledge, the understanding, and the following of the creational principles in true discernment, maturity, experience, their living and ability, whereby true inner and outward love, freedom and harmony, as well as peace and equalizedness become reality, as well as an essential life experience through a conscious application of these high values by conscious rationality and conscious intellect. Essence of wisdom in this sense comprises comprehension, practical experience, and the lived experience arising from knowledge, out of which also the right assessment of things and human beings takes place, as well as the life attitude, the mode of thoughts, feelings, and actions of the human being arising from it. This form of the essence of wisdom is, as a whole of thoughts, feelings, knowledge, experiences, living and actions, directly bound to the mental block and to the personality, as well as to the character, and namely itself, built up and carried from it.
What is your opinion about my statements and explanations? Can they be accepted as such, or are they still in need of correction?
There is nothing to add to the whole, since it corresponds to the correctness.
I feel as if I am listening to Quetzal with his "it corresponds to the correctness." But on the other hand, I sometimes allow myself to be tempted to use his correctness. Somehow, all of the peculiarities of a human being simply rub off on others.
Particular words or terms are just able to explain something precisely, which is why they are also adopted and used from one human being to another.
That is probably so. But tell me, what do you think about that of Iraq? According to my consideration, the civil war down there has already started a long time ago, even if the whole thing is not yet officially described as such.
This is indeed the case, whereby this is a religious, political, civil war that is being waged between the believers of the Sunnis and the Shiites, the blame for which rests solely with the USA, because they are the real originators, and have plunged the whole country and the population into chaos through their irresponsible military incursion and through the occupation and exploitation of Iraq. From the 23rd of November onwards, the Civil War will take on even more serious forms, because on that day there will be several murderous assassinations which, in Baghdad alone, will kill a total of 236 humans, which will, however, be trivialized by the United States and the new Iraqi government using a much smaller number. This will lead to talks taking place between Iraq and Iran on assistance, which will at least be within the framework of a pacification between the Sunnis and Shiites. The future will show what further emerges from this. Just as in the case of Israel and Palestine, where a new ceasefire will be announced, and Ehud Olmert will make major promises to the Palestinians, but this will be linked to counter-demands. And while I am already on the subject of predictions, then I can also mention the following upcoming and extraordinary events, which will occur until the month of December and into the year 2007. Firstly, a severe typhoon is to be mentioned, which will be called Durian, and which will haunt the Philippines at a speed of about 230 kilometers per hour with very heavy rainstorms. In particular, the main island Luzon, where the Mayan volcano has for some time repeatedly been very active. Towards the end of November, the hurricane will bring torrential rainfall, which will set in motion the masses of ash and lava recently ejected from the volcano, as well as much large lava rock, causing an enormous avalanche of mud, debris, and boulders to break away from the slopes of the volcano and partly bury 8 villages and the airport under layers several meters thick, after which the typhoon will move on and also bring damage and death to Vietnam. Unfortunately, as a result, almost 1,500 lives will have to be mourned, which is however not surprising, because as in many places on the earth, it is also the case in the Philippines that in an irrational and criminal-wise human settlements, villages and cities are put up at very dangerous places, where this should not be the case, such as in floodplains, directly on rivers, lakes, and oceans, as well as in their immediate vicinity, but also on volcanic slopes and in land areas which are endangered by lava ejections, mud, debris, and boulder avalanches, as well as by pyroclastic clouds, floods, or snow avalanches. But the Earth humans, in an unrational wise, do not adhere to the rules of safety in this respect, whereby, however, also the competent authorities act completely irresponsibly and grant permits for the construction of dwellings, etc., in such endangered places, and then also to live there. That much unrationality and unintellect should actually, as you always say, be punishable by law. But continue to hear what kind of predictions of extraordinary nature still arise. At the beginning of December, 2 remarkable events come about. Namely, on the one hand, a living giant squid of more than 7 meters in size is caught for the first time in the history of the terrestrial humankind off the Ogasawara Islands south of Tokyo, Japan, which is also called octopus by the human beings of Earth. This is a squid of the same species as the one you saw during the deep-sea dive on 30 May 1987 with Quetzal, and which is considered by human beings of Earth to be mythical creatures and delusions. That is to say, sailors' yarns. Its stretched-out suction arms will be almost 16 meters long, but unfortunately it will not survive the injuries caused by the capture. On the other hand, England will also be hit by a tornado at the beginning of December, which will move through London and cause greater destruction in the city. After that, a severe storm will sweep over France with a speed of around 180 kilometers per hour, which will also have a severe impact on the city of Paris. On the 10th of December, the death of the former Chilean dictator and mass murderer Augusto Pinochet, who led a terrorist regime for 17 years and had several thousand human beings tortured and murdered by his military, while many could only save their lives by fleeing Chile, will take place. Then it has to be said that starting in mid-December, Indonesia will be unusually stricken by severe flooding, whereby there will also be major landslides to be recorded, while in Somalia, major unrest will break out, and the transitional government will address a declaration of war to the Islamists who want to turn Somalia into an Islamist theocracy. This will also lead to Ethiopia, with its army and air force, helping the Somali government and bombing various places to expel the fanatical Islamists and bring them to reason. Of course, how could it possibly be otherwise? The USA, too, will interfere and position their naval forces in the ocean around the country, but they will also carry out bomb attacks on Somali villages. With regard to Iran, there is also a lot that must be said, because Ahmadinejad, the country's person wielding the might, will turn a deaf ear to an international decision on sanctions and steadfastly pursue Iran's nuclear program, which is in fact directed at producing nuclear weapons, which are intended to serve to attack Western Europe as well as Israel. Furthermore, Iran is secretly interfering in Iraq's affairs and supporting the terrorism that is taking place there, and indeed, so as to stir up the hatred of Israel and the Western world, whereby Ahmadinejad must be referred to as the ringleader. But before I forget about it and tell you other things, I have a question from Quetzal to pose to you. It concerns the following, which relates to himself.
Aha. At that point, I think it is probably better if he visits me, so that we can discuss the whole thing in detail.
That is certainly so. Then I will pass on your suggestion to him. Now I want to carry on with the predictions, of which there are still some.
I would first also have some things that I would like to ask you and discuss with you, if that is all right with you.
Of course, there is nothing to prevent that.
Thanks. Still something because of the weather. The winter is keeping us waiting, as you said at our last meeting, as however also that the climate changes ever more rapidly. Can you still briefly say something about that?
The climate warms ever faster, whereby the snowfall is also absent ever more frequently in the deeper sites, while the Earth's polar ice masses as well as the glaciers melt ever faster, which leads to this, that by the year 2100, in some cases, the water of the seas will rise up to 160 centimeters. Forceful natural changes have become unstoppable. Consequently, there is also a general change in the world of animals. Birds, fish, and the entirety of the fauna, as however also regarding the flora, because already it is all changing and is beginning to adapt to the new conditions of nature. Thus, it is also the case with the migratory birds which remain in their home areas in the winter and are no longer drawn to other domains. It is the same with migratory animals, because their pasture lands are changing and everything is taking on new forms.
And the origin of everything is overpopulation, which, however, neither humanity nor the responsible scientists, authorities, and governments want to accept as true. The more humans there are, the bigger become the entire environmental problems of interpersonal relationships, humans living together, illnesses, epidemics and criminality, as well as wrongdoing and wars, and so forth. And what is resolved, and eventually implemented, regarding climate protection and so forth, ends in a farce because the responsible ones are so stupid that they cannot think into the future. Consequently, they do not see that their resolved and perhaps implemented measures are only a drop of water on an ever-increasingly hot stone. That is therefore so, because, in the time in which the measures eventually become rectified, Earth's population increases by hundreds of millions again, and thereby naturally also all the problems, whereby the implemented measures to protect the environment already become worthless before they have even only begun. All the responsible ones are too stupid and narrow-minded to recognize that help in regard to the protection of the environment can thereby only be provided when the resolved measures, or the measures yet to be resolved, for the protection of the environment and the protection of the climate and so forth, are only useful in association with a regulation for a global halt to births. But as long as this is not recognized and is not implemented, so climb the problems of the destruction of the environment, energy problems, illnesses, epidemics, criminality, wrongdoing, wars and family dramas, absent interpersonal relationships, race hate, xenophobia, hate between and among humans, and religious hatred and so forth. In the same wise, the general softening of the human also increases regarding the quality of life, and the alacrity regarding a willingness to work on anything worthwhile and lasting. But overpopulation also brings with it that the human's entire body suffers ever more from damage to its health, because it is ever more susceptible to it. And also, in regard to the body's resilience to the ailments, suffering from illnesses and diseases, the human is becoming ever softer, less capable and vulnerable, which often ends in cowardly suicide. The quality of the affirmation of life sinks just as rapidly as also does the respect for life generally. But the effects of overpopulation are also demonstrated by humans becoming ever more uneducated and becoming addicted to evil vices, habits, and degenerations, whereby the most common forms are especially alcohol, drugs, and excessive seeking of pleasure and craving for travel, as well as degenerated sexual cravings. Parents ever more commonly leave their children undefended, allow them to starve and die of thirst, beat them to death, force them into prostitution or sell them, while in other families, conflict and strife, as well as battery and jealousy, rule between the marriage partners, which often leads to the dissolution of the entire family through murder and homicide. And still, ever more, only hate, profit craving, strife, disharmony, bondage, vice, addiction, revenge, and the like rule among the individual humans, among the peoples, and even the entirety of humanity, because only few honestly concern themselves with love, peace, freedom, harmony, and a valuable living together for good interpersonal relationships, and a creationally correct manner of living, as well as for a good and deliberate evolution of the consciousness. Out of that, it also results that for the majority of humankind, true love and friendship are only empty and worthless words, and yet only isolated humans are lovingly concerned about the well-being of their neighbor. And what do the responsible ones of the governments do against all this evil? Nothing. They only thirst after their high and far overloaded stipends. However, undertake nothing valuable in order to discern the true facts of all the evil, and to undertake anything truly effective to stop all the need and all the misery of humanity, as well as of nature, the environment, the climate, and the planet. They crank out only hollow and empty words, let their own life be a good one, and do not concern themselves even so much as a pinch of filth about all the countless problems. And if, for once, a true human comes into a government, who works in the sense of truth and reality for the people and the homeland, as for example, in Switzerland, the upper house member Christoph Blocher, who can be called the only truthful member, and represents the interests of the righteous, thinking and intelligent ones, as well as the interests of the country and thereby the homeland, who really recognizes the real problems and wants to change them to the better. Then, in their own ranks, as well as among the people and in the parties, all the inexpert, incapable, and those who are weak in intelligence step into the plan and, with abuse and insults and opprobrium, shout down the ones who are industriously concerned with the good and best changes. And, as a rule, they do it, therefore, because they, on one hand, exercise their power and do not want what is right and good, and on the other hand, because their intelligence does not reach far enough to recognize the effective truth, and, in regard to this, to do that which is correct and valuable. Therein the evil also takes root, such that those who govern are not capable of teaching the people through appropriate schooling as regards the creational and natural laws, so that the human beings slowly but surely turn to the effective life and effective way of living, and thereby also true love, freedom, harmony, and true peace, as well as true humaneness.
Facts that are already often named in our conversations, and which you have carried out into the world, which up until now, however, have by and large borne no fruit.
Nevertheless, I will not give up and teach and publish the whole thing over and over again. However, if I now want to say something more with regard to the happenings in Iraq and in Israel as well as Palestine and Afghanistan, Then the following. Warfare in the world is taking on ever-worsening forms, including with regard to the civil war in Iraq, where extreme Sunnis and Shiites are confusingly led in thinking that they must carry out jihad, or holy war with weapons, namely both against those who believe likewise as well as against those who are of another religion. That is to say, unbelievers, as they are called. In the case of the Sunnis and Shiites and vice versa, who fight each other, or in the case of the Taliban, it has to be said that jihad is completely misunderstood, because by this, Muhammad meant something completely different than to wage war by force of arms. His real teaching, namely, was to the effect that by the jihad he understood the individual struggle of the human being against himself or herself, in order to become a good, positive, virtuous and true, dignified and honorable human being. Thus, Muhammad's teaching of jihad is fundamentally to the effect that the human being shall not wage the holy war with deadly weapons and not against other human beings, but against himself or herself, in order to gain self-cognition and truth, so that he or she can truly live in humanity as a human being and fulfill the creational laws and recommendations. But this teaching of Muhammad has been thoroughly falsified as well as wrongly interpreted, and indeed up to the present day. This has also been done with the teaching that the human being shall live rightly, well, positively and virtuously as well as law-fulfillingly and recommendation-fulfillingly, in order to be an example in an instructive wise to the children and adolescents as well as to adults of all ages, just as all the prophets taught, even if it was presented by them with other words. The fact that these parts of Muhammad's teaching, along with many others, were falsified, led to the fact that many aspects of his teaching also led to false explanations and to evil consequences, as this unfortunately still continues to have an effect today, in particular by the radical, terroristic Islamism of those confusingly led, who pass themselves off as Muslim men and Muslim women, but neither understand nor live the teaching of Islam. True Muslim males and Muslim females see and live Islam in a different and peaceful kind and wise, thus not in war and terror against those who believe differently of their own Islamic religion or other religions. True Muslim males and Muslim females are not extremist Islamists and therefore not terrorists, for they are in truth striving to be peaceful and true human beings in self-cognition, and also to live in peace and humaneness with those who are of another religion.
Those are good words.
There is, however, something more to say about this, namely, that it corresponds to a widespread misunderstanding that each Islamic war was a war of religion, and that it had always been the seal culmination point of the war to forcibly and inevitably convert the defeated peoples to Islam with the sword. Of course, there were such wars of religion, but this only applies to the early fightings of Muhammad, in which he had to raise the sword perforce against Jewish and Meccan opponents of the Madanese community. Otherwise he would have been murdered with his followers. Surah 9:5 solely refers to this, in which the following was taught in the real original form by Muhammad.
And when the forbidden months have passed, then resist your adversaries who serve tin gods, where you meet them, seize them, and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in their own ambush, to put them in captivity. But only deprive them of their lives when self-defense requires it. But if they repent, then put mercy before justice. Let them pay the zakat tax for the poor, and give them the freedom that they can go their way.
But since the falsification of this aphorism has found its entrance into Islam, it has been taught and also translated in the following form.
And when the forbidden months have passed, then kill the servants of tin gods where you meet them, and seize them and besiege them, and lie in wait for them in every ambush. But if they repent, and if they do the prayer, and pay the zakat tax for the poor, then grant them their way. Truly, Allah is all-forgiving, benevolent.
Or another translation version.
Slay the servants of tin gods where you find them, but if they repent and do the prayer, and pay the poor tax, then let them go their way.
The truth is that neither in this nor in other teaching verses has Muhammad spoken thereof, that enemies should simply be beaten to death and killed, but he spoke about the fact that this may be the case only in actual self-defense. As at all times, when Muhammad's effective and true teaching was falsified, it is then further falsified by wannabe knowing scribblers, in which case insults of the prophets and untrue ragbag stories become the norm. In fact, it would be necessary, as with the Talmud Emmanuel, that Muhammad's teaching be post-written in accordance with how he actually brought his teaching. Now, as far as the effectiveness with regard to Islamic wars is concerned, in the later history of Islam, many wars were purely secular wars of conquest, as such have been connected with every migration of peoples since time immemorial. This was also the case in the conquest of Palestine by the ancient Hebrews, as well as in all Germanic, Arabic, and other worldwide migrations of peoples. And as with Christianity in the Seven Crusades, etc., the Arab wars of conquest also had a characteristically religious background, which in particular is willingly overlooked, concealed, or disputed by Christianity in regard to its own wars of conquest. Now, the fact in the Islamic wars of conquest is that even though there was a religious background, the defeated peoples fundamentally recognized the Islamic suzerainty by simply paying the required tribute. However, as far as their religion, that is to say their belief and their worship were concerned as well as the civil regulations, they could thus keep everything without having had to make amends for it or having been forced to Islam. The Islamic idea of theocracy did not exclude, but rather included, tolerance toward those who were of another religion, for submission was of purely political form. Of course, there have been fanatics since the year one and also since every beginning. As with Christianity and all religions, except Buddhism and Islam, who used Muhammad's teaching in a wrong and falsified wise for their claims for might and actually tried to spread Islam with the sword. Which is why this has also spread as knowledge worldwide, and unfortunately is not to be denied. But those who acted in such a wise were not real Muslims, but perverted fanatics who utilized falsified teaching parts for their own benefit. So, if also I speak, talk, or write about it, such as in the book Ein offenes Wort, an open word, in German only as of 2023, that facts are to be quoted in the teaching of Islam, which are connected with war, the sword, murder and manslaughter, etc., then it exclusively concerns facts that have arisen due to the falsification of the Quran, and which have nothing to do with the effective truth and reality, because Muhammad had not brought a teaching of war and murder, but a teaching of love, of truth, freedom, harmony, and of peace for all human beings on the earth, and indeed irrespective whatsoever of what race, religion, other belief orientations, or which people and which social status they belong to. He did so in the same wise as all the prophets of his lineage, before him and after him.
Good words again, but that is not surprising. If it were different, then you would not be the proclaimer who brings the teaching of the Spirit as well as the teaching of the truth and the teaching of the life.
Then something else. Quite some time ago, my son Natan approached me and asked me a few things concerning the intelligence, whereby he explained that in his vocational school, they were teaching that the intelligence would remain constant throughout a lifetime. An unmatched idiocy, since already your father's Fath taught me that the human being's intelligence is continuously widening throughout the life. Intelligence consists fundamentally of the ability of understanding, which can only be given by rationality. Rationality and intellect are pre-given, on the one hand, gene-based, and, on the other hand, by the consciousness, which is programmed by the overall consciousness block, but which also is evolution-capable and therefore also capable of learning, which means that rationality and intellect can be widened during the course of the life. Hence the intelligence consists of rationality and intellect, and thus also of the understanding and the insight, as well as of the rational evaluation of a matter or situation, etc. With regard to a conscious consciousness, As is the case with the human being, rationality and intellect in their evolutionary form are inseparably connected with each other, because only from this results the ability of the conscious insight, the finding, inventing, recognizing, coming to terms with, and the understanding of all old and new things, situations and circumstances of life, etc. It inevitably and unambiguously follows from this that the human being's rationality and intellect are learnable, and as such thus contingent on evolution, which in a certain instinct-based sense also applies to animals and other creatures of the land, the air, and the water, which is why one can also use the expression animal intelligence. What is to be said with regard to human beings, however, is that it is very difficult for human beings themselves to appraise their own talents and strengths, because the rule is that human beings love to overrate themselves. A fact based on human beings usually seeing themselves better and more gifted than they are in reality. So, it is difficult for them themselves to comprehensively self-evaluate whether they are rather linguistically inclined, with deep feelings for the others, logically mathematically inclined, talented with craftsmanship, musically, in the art of writing, or in some muse, etc. It is especially difficult for a human being to choose a very specific strength or weakness. Also, whether a strength or weakness is innate or acquired cannot be answered easily, because no unambiguous answer can be given for it. The fact is that, on the one hand, about 50% of the intelligence, and thus of the rationality and the intellect, is determined both genetically as well as by the programming of the consciousness. In addition to genetic inheritance and the programming of the consciousness by the overall consciousness block, regarding the other 50%, the conscious learning and the entire environment, the absorption of knowledge as well as the practical experience and the lived experience its living play the most important roles, because thereby the conscious evolution of the consciousness, and thus of the intelligence, that is to say the rationality and the intellect, takes place. Through these processes, a continuous self-evolutionizing and self-optimizing improvement of intelligence is created. Hence it can be seen from this that intelligence is first of all based on rationality and intellect, but equally on the sum of all imaginable abilities, whereby of course the ability to recognize a problem and to solve it in an ethical manner belongs to them. The intelligence does not only include the abilities of the linguistic and logical mathematical factors, as well as the spatial rationality and the spatial intellect, but also the abilities of the emotionality, the thoughts and feelings, the being human in the real and true sense, as well as the creativity and the skillfulness in relation to the modes of action of every kind. Also, the wise of dealing with one's own body and the physical and sensual drives, one's own and the parental educational factors as well as the personal mentality, self-cognition, self-assurance, self-realization, and the feeling of self-value are of enormous importance with regard to the intelligence and its evaluation. And all these factors are bound to a steady evolution. Consequently, they are constantly changing and expanding during the course of life, which results in a stable personality, connected with a stable character, and a valueful fundamental attitude regarding the life and the life conduct. However, the stability does not mean a remaining or a stagnation in the personality trait, but rather a steady widening for the better of the trait, which inevitably means that the intelligence also widens and does not constantly remain at the same level during the life. In other words, if only the linguistic as well as the logical, mathematical, and spatial intelligence is measured in the so-called IQ tests, then this corresponds to a definition that is fundamentally wrong and does not express the real degree of intelligence of the human being. So if the IQ is in this common way equated with the intelligence, then this corresponds only to an abstract construct and is much too narrowly framed. Hence, thus, a human being with a high IQ may be incapable of living, and may be an absolute zero in regard to being human in the real and true sense, the life capability and everything that evolution demands. This is how your father Svath taught me, and he was a very wise man.
Indeed he was, therefore, I have nothing to add to your detailed explanation.
See here, my friend, there I have an email from Brazil saying that a certain UFO researcher and spiritist named John Val Elam, whose real name is Rogério de Almeida Freitas, is making a name for himself. Thus, here is the following, which I read to you, as it is written.
Ufologists got news from extraterrestrials. Contact with aliens is imminent. The well-known Brazilian UFO researcher and spiritist John Val Elam announced, according to a report by Radio Cooperativa, the soon-to-be contact with extraterrestrial life forms. The historic event is scheduled to take place already in a few months. John Val Elam, also known as Rogério de Almeida Freitas, has already been claiming for years to be in contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, cosmic friends, and to receive information from them which he would record accurately. In this way, John Val Elam also claims to have received the news that a first official contact between human beings and extraterrestrial life forms would be imminent. Already in the days between the 15th of November 2006 and the April 2007, so the ufologist had announced it on the Congresso Nacional de Ufologia Científica in Curitiba, humankind would face different extraterrestrial races. Source: Paranews. Net.
This man continues to say,
I was told that the encounter will take place in the coming months. The contact will make no one in the world doubt that they exist, said John Val Elam. No government, not the media, not the science, and also no religious or military organization will be able to deny it.
according to the UFO researcher's further explanation to a Brazilian newspaper, the extraterrestrial races would nevertheless regard the human beings as a lost, intriguing species driven by hatred and ambition. This would be the reason why it would be so difficult to enter into a connection with us. John Val Elam also described that he would know that his claim would simply seem ridiculous to many people. However, he would just act as a bridge between the civilizations.
The whole thing is known to me, and it is based on consciously deceptive nonsense as well as on a schizophrenic disposition. Talking about it would also be senseless.
Clear answer. Then once again a question that also refers to something related to UFOs, because there is a story going around on the internet about a certain Mr. X who is said to have appeared in December 2005 and who allegedly, according to the title Mr. X Speaks Out on Secret UFO Archives, worked on secret archives about UFOs and extraterrestrials for a contractor company of the U.S. Department of Defense. An author, Bill Ryan, and an author, Carrie Cassidy, are responsible for the publication of the story. The story seems very strange to me, since certain contradictions appear as well as ideas for world improvement. Rail fantasies, strange claims about statements of alleged extraterrestrials, and also inconsistent claims regarding Roswell and other UFO crashes, etc.
These fantasies are also known to me, but they are not to be taken seriously. Like all the other nonsense, which is spread by many female and male wannabe greats all over the world in an addicted-to-show-off manner in the context of extraterrestrials and their flying machines, etc.
Then something else. I was at the big quake in California with Quetzal, that is to say in San Francisco, the quake which is already overdue. Have any new things come evolved on that? Or does everything remain as Quetzal told me? That the earthquake is to be expected in the foreseeable future, and that it will be the biggest natural disaster in living memory. The quake will not just have a negative impact upon San Francisco, but also Los Angeles, San Diego, and various other places. And as Quetzal said, possibly the seaward part of the San Andreas Fault will tear off, whereby an elongated island would result.
You have seen the enormous destruction in the future, however, only in relation to the beginning time. But the entirety will, however, be much worse when the great quake occurs. The point in time has remained the same as that which Quetzal named for you.
Therefore, everything remains as predicted and as it was, as I have seen then through the travel into the future.
It was, at that time, a journey into the real time of the future of the real event. Consequently, also nothing about it can change.
Naturally, how stupid of me. Oh well, I have here yet another question. Because someone has asked me for an answer in the bulletin regarding on what Charles Darwin, in 1859, has constructed his theory of evolution, that the human being would be descended from apes. I learned from your father, Sfath, that Darwin falsified an ape skeleton in order to prove his theory, whereby, however, his assertion, being that the human descended from apes, did not even grow out of his own rubbish. In reality, as Sfath explained, Charles Darwin was linked with Tibetan Buddhists, who told him of the Tibetan legend, according to which all human beings would descend from 8 different branches of apes. Can I convey my answer in this form?
Of course, because what my father explained to you corresponds to the truth. Darwin was a human who craved renown and did everything illicitly and dishonestly to greatly build up his image. The Darwinian teaching of evolution in regard to the Earth humans, that they originally arose from the apes, is truly not based on his own thought processes or from his own research, rather on a Tibetan legend that all humans descended from 8 different branches of apes. Darwin put the legend to use, whereby he accordingly filed certain bones of an ape skeleton in order to substantiate and provide a line of evidence for his deceit, and presented the whole thing to the scientific body of the day.
Darwin, as founder of the so-called modern theory of evolution, actually did study medicine and then later theology, whereby he came into contact with Buddhists from Tibet. Indeed, he was generally dealt with as a naturalist, but that role started as he took part in the world voyage of the survey ship Beagle, which was underway on the world seas from 1831 until 1836. From 1842, as I have read, he began to work on his comprehensive travel experiences and systematically collected his extensive material together in regard to the origin of the species. Geological observations, as well as those of fauna as it pertains to geography, caused him to doubt the rightness of the traditional teaching of the inalterability of the species. From that also arose his main work, The Origin of the Species Through Natural Selection, which constituted a turning point in the history of biology in 1859. With the theory of selection, which led to Darwinism, respectively to the Darwinian teachings of descent, he explained the purposive adaptation of forms of life to the environment. That he thereby also tried to underpin his teachings through the fraud of his adaptation of ape bones, and that he presented the Tibetan legend, that all humans are arisen from 8 branches of apes, as reality, then led to the erroneous teaching that the human descended from apes, whereby this has endured until today, and even the scientists grant their belief to this deception. In 1871, he then published 2 volumes entitled The Descent of Man. Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in the Mount at Shrewsbury in England, and he died on April 19, 1882, in Downhouse, which corresponds to today's London Bromley. Are these statements true so far?
All of it corresponds to the correctness. Yes, those are the actual facts.
Then yet again, a bulletin question which relates to the 13th Dalai Lama. The question is this: why did the 13th Dalai Lama Mongolian Dalai Doba of an ocean of learned knowledge and Tibetan Blama, the superior, have to flee from the Chinese? The question is somewhat confusing, because Quetzal taught me something else, however, you also did, consequently, to my knowledge, it was not the 13th Dalai Lama who fled from the Chinese, rather the 14th, who is actually called Tenzin Gyatso, and who was born in 1935 and enthroned in 1940. His current domicile, if I am not mistaken, is Dharamsala in the constituent state of Himachal Pradesh in India. In 1959, he fled to India as the Chinese occupied Tibet, because the Dalai Lama is, in truth, not a religious head, rather a political head. even if something else is asserted by the Lamists, who say that he is the highest spiritual dignitary. He emerged as the political power holder in the context of the Tibetan government in exile led by him, in order to obtain a real autonomous Tibet through negotiations with the Chinese government, whereby the Dalai Lama is then naturally supposed to constitute the sovereign, respectively, the political ruler. The Tibetan government in exile is not officially acknowledged by any country. Even when the 14th Dalai Lama emerges as the spiritual dignitary of Lamaism and officially stands up in the world for tolerance among the religions and the peoples, as well as for the observation of humanity's global responsibility. In the background, hidden in his deeds, is actually his political power nature, which he gladly wants to exercise in Tibet, and presumably even in the entire world. With him it is therefore about power, which was already the case with the 13th Dalai Lama, who was the political leader of Tibet, and also with the others before him. He chased the Panchen Lama, respectively Panchen Lama, meaning learned philosopher, respectively the spiritual leader and co-regent of Tibet, into flight, and indeed in the year 1923. His flight led him to China, where a large Buddhist community offered him protection. His life was threatened by the 13th Dalai Lama, who had sent out his soldiers to mercilessly immediately shoot the Panchen Lama if they got hold of him. You have also taught me that on one hand, the Lamist Lhasa, the Lamist center in Tibet, is, so to speak, a secret world center in Asia, and that, secondly, Lamaism is an Ausgeartete, has gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature, and despotic sect which cannot be equated with Buddhism, although the Dalai Lama and the Lamists refer to Buddhism in regard to their religion. Accordingly, the national religion of Tibet also cannot be called Buddhism, rather only Lamism, which has nothing to do with real Buddhism, if nowadays a true Buddhism may be spoken of at all, because, even with this, very many things were distorted, and indeed, even in regard to the teaching of Gautama Buddha. Consequently, the real teaching was only taught, understood, and lived by the Prophet himself. True Buddhism knows neither Gestalt as using, with all the coercive means that are at one's disposal, physical, psychical, mental, and consciousness-based powers, abilities and skills, in order to carry out and carry through tremendous actions and deeds, nor might, nor despotism or forms of unfreedom, of discord or of disharmony. Yet what is taught and lived today, also with all other religions and sects, has nothing more, or not much more, to do with the actual teachings of the Prophet Buddha, because these were thoroughly distorted. The Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, who today cruises around in the world, promotes a free Tibet and writes books with inexpert content, is not a Buddhist at all, rather a Lamaist who strives for state power. Who then still wonders that he had to flee from the Chinese? The fact is that the Tibetan Lamists committed monstrous atrocities before the Chinese again took over control of Tibet, whereby, at any rate, they are also to blame for unbelievable atrocities. Naturally, this truth is vehemently disputed and denied as well as twisted from all sides, as also is the truth that, after the founding of the People's Republic of China, Tibet became the most important bulwark and the forbidden land of the communist countries in order to stop the British Empire which, with evil force, attempted to spread itself out further in Asia. The truth is that Tibet's independence was first discussed in 1840, and indeed with the so-called Opium War. At that time, the West's invasion of China began, whereby the British attempted to separate Tibet from China. That was also the time in which the great and worldwide espionage network was built up, which had already been constructed under Queen Elizabeth I of England in the 17th century, and which has been maintained in the most various forms up to the current time. That is, on the whole, that which I have been taught by you.
You have held everything in your memory well.
Despite these facts, most Western countries revere the Dalai Lama in particular, as also, however, do the Tibetan Lamists, whereby neither these believers nor the Western worshippers and followers know the actual facts about the Dalai Lama and Lamaism. The believers of Lamaism are so duped that they follow the Dalai Lama blindly and neither examine the background of this nor the background of the machinations of Lamaism. There are only few real experts in the entire matter about the Dalai Lama and Lamaism. As, for example, diverse journalists who also name the facts openly, as, for example, in 2000, when the German media openly challenged the Dalai Lama and talked plainly. 1. That he defames his critics, respectively, slanders them, and brings them into disrepute. 2. That he actively oppresses religious minorities, however, otherwise plays the good human. 3. That he has knowingly falsified the history of Tibet and his flight, and so forth. 4. That he perfidiously exploits his political status and his power as head of the Lamaists over the believers. 5. That he oppresses any political and religious opposition to himself. 6. That he has fallen into a most extreme tyrannical and undemocratic leadership style. 7. That he maintains rituals which are misogynistic, antagonistic to women. 8. That he maintained and maintains friendship-based contacts with former SS members, Nazi bigwigs, as well as with neo-Nazis. What there is further to say relates to the USA, which indeed cannot possibly be at all otherwise, whose Secret Service CIA plays a decisive role in the more recent history of Tibet. As Quetzal once said, the CIA, according to his statement, was the authoritative factor behind the success of the Dalai Lama's flight to India, where he lived in exile and was supported by the U.S. Secret Service as well as the guerrilla army, respectively. The armed Tibetan Lamist troops, who caused much harm and perpetrated monstrous atrocities, however, in reality, could not accomplish much to bring Tibet under their and the Dalai Lama's control. Nevertheless, however, the acts of the guerrilla army had a great significance for the morale of the community of Tibetan exiles who fled to various countries, because they hoped that a return to a free Tibet would be possible for them, whereby they only knew the propaganda of the Dalai Lama, which is always still the case, while the truth is withheld from them, and that the CIA in Tibet also forcefully functioned otherwise, was also clearly connected, among other things, with the occurrences of uranium, which the country had to offer, and which was not supposed to fall into the hands of the Russians. However, in regard to Tibet, other powers also played their notes, as, for example, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky 831, who spread the nonsense of the ascended Tibetan masters in the West, allegedly transmitted for the first time in 1870, which firstly and lastly has influenced the entire New Age movement, which directly, with its criticism of culture and community, initially came about in the Californian counterculture of the 1960s. The term New Age is, however, much older than the current trends and leads back into the 19th century, and indeed to occult and esoteric worldviews which, as said, were also influenced by Helena Blavatsky. Influenced by that were indeed also the National Socialistic Nazi Rudolf Hess and Sebottendorf, who, together in 1918 respectively, 1919 in Munich, founded the secret Thule Society, a lodge-type association which was constructed on the principles of Lamaist teaching. This alliance functioned as an umbrella organization for old German, fatherland-orientated and ethnicity-orientated societies of Munich. The alliance pushed predominantly anti-Semitic propaganda, whereby the crowning joke of the matter is that from out of these assimilated ideologies, which were popular at the time, the founding of the United Nations came forth in the year 1945. The entire thing came forth out of the 1912 founded German Thule sect, which was connected with the 1910 founded Hammer Alliance and with the Radical People's Old German Association. Their symbols were the swastika, respectively, the hooked cross and the Germanic runes. The association had its own newspaper, the Municher Observer. The Thule Society was comprised of 1,500 members who had connections with broad sectors of Bavarian society. Along with Rudolf Hess and Sebottendorf, many other National Socialists also belonged to the Thule Society, who also contributed to the development of subversive plans and promoted counter-revolutionary groups, as for example, the German Workers' Party and the NSDAP, Nazi Party. By name of National Socialist German Workers' Party, German Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei NSDAP, which had come out of it. Then, in 1919, the Thule Society organized a militant fighting union which decisively took part in the Free Corps to strike down the Bavarian Council Republic. That, my friend, correlates to that which I still know in regard to the history, whereby, however, I have still read up somewhat to freshen my memory.
What you say corresponds to the reality.
It is really a burden in terms of the human beings of the earth. To see how they build up their religions and sects, and how might is gained from them, and how in turn wars, hardship, and misery are caused by that again. A world without God, religions and sects, rather, a world with human beings who would live according to the rationality, the intellect and the truth about the creation, as well as its laws and recommendations, would be a world in which the human beings would lead their lives in true love and humanity, as well as in peace, freedom and harmony. Unfortunately, however, this is not the case, and consequently, there are hardly any truthfully interpersonal relationships anymore. Since today, interpersonal relationships are hardly nurtured in love any longer, but rather only according to the values and profits that can be gained from them.
A true word that should be heard in the earth human's ear.
An ear which, regrettably, does not want to hear it, although it corresponds to the truth. But there is something else to ask. Many Christian-touched people try to prove by all possible and impossible means that the Shroud of Turin, as well as the tunic of Argenteuil and the so-called bloodcloth of Christ, would actually trace back to Emmanuel, whereby also blood traces on the shrouds are supposed to prove this, etc. Can you perhaps say anything more about this?
All these machinations are very well known to me, and they are machinations that have been falsified in the name of the Christianity. Therefore, falsifiers who had come into possession of the shrouds sold them as Emmanuel relics to the believing Christians. During the whole deception, a Jew was involved whose name we could not determine, but who inflicted a wound on himself in order to fabricate the forgery and caught the blood that was used to prepare the relics. On this basis, the false claim is now built up that the relics were indeed those that would belong to Emmanuel, and that the blood was that of Emmanuel, which, however, does not correspond to the facts.
Therefore so. And do you know what blood group Emmanuel had?
Indeed, we know that. It was blood group 0 negative.
And the cloth of the shroud, for example, do you know who had woven it?
No, this is unknown to me. Our very difficult investigations only revealed that the merchant Caesar Canova, depicted on the cloth in his death, had acquired this as an old piece in Syria to serve as a robe. And because he cherished the old robe, he wore it on his commercial journeys to various countries, such as Israel, where he also traded at the Dead Sea and traveled through the Palestinian mountains. But he also wore the robe in Turkey, and when he went about his trade in France and Italy, etc., when Canova then died, his brother paid his last respects by using the robe for the merchant's image.
Then, I estimate, it is possible that soil, plant leaves, and plant pollen from all these places were able to deposit in the robe during his travels. Am I right with this assumption? If so, then that should be detectable.
You are not mistaken, because that was actually the case. And all these things can still be found today in the relics. Therefore, these are used for Christian-directed false analyses and false Christian belief-based claims.
Here I have what you said during the 215th contact on 15th April 2006 regarding the origination of the shroud.
The shroud does not show the image of Emmanuel, but that of a merchant from Turin, Italy, called Caesar Canova. The shroud was made by the brother of the deceased, Luciano Canova, an alchemist. The process took place on the 7th of June, 1324, and lasted until 10th of June, that is to say, 4 days. During this, the procedure was not such that the shroud was placed on the deceased and the latter was rubbed with chemicals, as is often claimed, but it was a very early form of photography, whereby the corpse was placed vertically in front of a large glass lens, through which the image was then projected for 4 days through an effect of sunlight onto a large fabric surface soaked in chemicals in a dark room, after which the shroud was then treated with silver nitrate, and thus the image became visible and was retained.
That corresponds to the given.
Do you still continue to research these things?
Our respective data are complete.
So, no further research is needed. However, you certainly know more than just what we have discussed.
Of course.
But this would probably take us too far now. So, let's leave it at that. Well, then let me now please hear what you still have to say.
Well, the following is furthermore emerging. On December 26th, the highest court of appeal in Baghdad will confirm the death sentence passed on Saddam Hussein, which will lead to worldwide protest, whereby, however, how could it also be otherwise, the USA and first and foremost the good Christian U.S., President George W. Bush will favorably respond to and cheer the death sentence and the execution by hanging in the early morning of 30th of December, because he believes that he can thereby still justify the war in Iraq after all. Responsibility for the death sentence and the execution lies solely with the fanatical, sectarian and delusion-obsessed U.S. President Bush and all his supporters, because if that were not so, then Saddam Hussein's punishment would be lifelong imprisonment. Thus, already the first death sentence came solely about as a result of the U.S.'s might, as will be the case with regard to the confirmation of the sentence by the highest court of appeal in Baghdad. First and foremost, the death sentence stands as an act of personal revenge by U.S. President George W. Bush, who acts as a godly judge and executioner with regard to Saddam Hussein, playing lord over life and death.
Just a moment. I would also like to say something about this. In my opinion, it will also be the case in Iraq that all addicts of revenge will howl in favor and with hurrahs, because Saddam's enemies only know hatred and revenge, which is understandable on the one hand, if one considers the atrocities and mass murders which he himself committed, or which he had committed by his henchmen. But hatred and revenge must never so Oscar-arted get badly out of control of the good human nature, that murder is paid back with murder. The death penalty is always murder, and a country which carries out the death penalty is a country of the terror and of the dictatorship, as is also applicable to the USA. The death penalty is never reconcilable with a democracy, nor with freedom, peace, love, humanness, and harmony. If, then, the megalomaniac U.S. president advocates the death penalty, something he has already done throughout his life, and has already sent more than 70 innocent human beings to their deaths as governor, then the lout has no faint idea what democracy, freedom, love, peace, and harmony really are. When seen solely from the national perspective, the death penalty cannot be reconciled with these values, whether in times of peace or war, because death penalty is and remains murder and contradicts the creational natural law of self-defense. And indeed, even if the human being sentenced to death is a single or repeated murderer himself or herself. The death penalty is also a fundamentally malicious, pathological craving for revenge and human unworthy process against the human rights, as these were proclaimed by the General Assembly of the United Nations on 10th of December 1948, and which in this respect state in Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And Article 5 states, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Saddam Hussein, too, is a human being, And in fact, even if he has gotten completely out of control of his good human nature and is a killer and mass murderer, to whom, however, the freedom can no longer be granted, because he has forfeited it through his delinquency. But he has the right to his life and his safety, therefore he must not be tortured by a death sentence and also not be executed. It must also be considered that a death sentence is carried out by depriving a helpless and defenseless person of life, because he or she is unarmed at the mercy of the executioners, and therefore no act of self-defense is given, which would warrant a killing. Executing a death sentence is an act of Ausartung to get very badly out of control of the good human nature that contradicts the creational natural law, which reads, "You shall not kill in perversion." Executing a death sentence without a given self-defense means murder in Ausartung. Thus, every death penalty must be rejected, and no matter under what circumstances, because a killing of a human being is only permitted in absolute self-defense, when there is no other possibility left to protect and preserve one's own or another's life. But a person sentenced to death is deprived of his or her weapons and possibilities by which he might continue to be harmful by murdering, in Ausartung or otherwise, because as a rule he or she is in safe custody and cannot create a self-defense situation which would justify a killing in self-defense. And to come back once again to Saddam Hussein, of course he is a multi-murderer, because he himself murdered a number of human beings with his own hands, just as he also obliged his henchmen to do so. Therefore, he must be severely punished for it. That should probably be clear, but the punishment for it would have to be lifelong imprisonment, with the opportunity of hard work for the preservation of life, as well as the opportunity of learning in relation to a change of his inner core nature for the better and good. Such a punishment alone would be fair, and would bring benefits, contrary to the death by which no atonement is made, but instead, an end is put to this possibility before it can even occur.
Again and again I am astonished by how you are able to explain the facts with clear words. Death penalty can never be reconciled with democracy, as you rightly say, nor with freedom, peace, harmony, and humanness. Death penalty is always, and in any case, a sign of dictatorship, unpeace, sectarianism, unfreedom, lovelessness, disharmony, inadequacy, and unhumaneness. And all these unvalues blaze in those human beings who advocate for the death penalty, just as these unvalues exist dictatorially in those states which fight for and exercise the death penalty in their legislation. A state which carries out the death penalty is a state of the murderous felony which has no right to exist.
Actually, I could still have said that too, if this thought had occurred to me.
That might have been possible. But let me now tell you what I still have to mention with regard to predictions, before I have to leave again, because my duty is calling me. On the 11th of January 2007, the U.S. President Bush will try to regain all his might, and namely, by hypocritically appearing in front of the American people and admitting mistakes that had been committed in Iraq, for which he takes on the responsibility contrary to his true mentality. Through this insidious machination, he tries to win back the American people for himself. But on the other hand, he also thereby aims to bring the Senate and the Parliament on his side, because against all rationality and against all good advice, he wants to augment the U.S. American troops in Iraq by more than 20,000 men. A fact which brings no order and no peace to Iraq, rather only intensifies hatred of the entire USA, whereby new unrest and bloody attacks by the insurgents take place. However, Bush will not say a word about the fact that the bellicose invasion of Iraq by the U.S. armed forces was the very biggest mistake and destroyed the entire structures of the country and much more, because he is so sick in his sectarian world of thoughts that he cannot recognize and also cannot admit his malicious responsibility for everything. He is a man who has fallen into a terrible sectarian and might-greedy delusion and can no longer recognize the irresponsibility of his actions in this. But all those who pay homage to him both in their own country and throughout the whole world are not able to recognize this, because they themselves lack the necessary intelligence to comprehend the real truth with regard to this delusion-obsessed state might holder of the USA. These human beings, both among the people as well as in the governments, lack rationality, intellect, and responsibility. Consequently, they act within a framework that must simply be called criminal and felonious. In the second week of January 2007, in the United States, the state of California will be afflicted by an unusual cold spell, whereby there will also be heavy snow to be registered. Then, on 13th January, a new strong seaquake of 8.8 magnitude will take place near the Kuril Islands, but no tsunami will occur. This quake is still in connection with the preceding series of earthquakes and seaquakes, as I previously mentioned to you on the 15th of October. Those, my friend, are the last details that I can mention for the time being. I will tell you more when I come back in the month of January next year. So I have only some few things left to discuss with you, which shall not be official, after which I then must go. It concerns on the one hand the following.